Hello, and welcome again to our weekly online Bible study from Pine Valley Church of Christ as we continue our study of Peter's first letter to those early Christians who were living in the northern part of what is modern day Turkey. And as they were struggling with their own faith, whether they came from a Jewish background and wondering whether the suffering they were feeling was really worth it, should they go back to the law of Moses, or the Gentiles who were being ridiculed by family and friends and considering, thinking about, is this really worth it? The Paul or Peter wants to emphasize and repeat over and over to them that this salvation that they have in Jesus Christ is truly a salvation that is worth suffering for. So let me pull up our screen here. Something that we find very consistently throughout the New Testament, as well as even early historical writers, is that the early Christians had a uh, very strong feeling that Jesus was going to return any day. And there's even exhortations by Paul to those in Thessalonica who were already beginning to wonder, well, it's been several years now. Why hasn't he come? And he reminds them of the importance of hanging on and making sure that they continue to live by their faith each and every day, however long it takes. And Peter does the same thing here. Because I asked in your discussion questions as well as Sunday morning, if what would you do if you knew the exact day and time that you were going to die? And it probably would depend on how long a period that is. Is it tomorrow? Is it a few hours? Is it next week? Is it several years from now? But as you got closer to that time, what would you be making sure that you're doing? And it lends an urgency to the way in which we think and the way in which we act. And that's the urgency which Peter is trying to hang on to, even as he knows his physical life is about to end. But he wants them, even after he's gone, to understand the importance of carrying on to the end as he is seeking to do in his own life. Because this salvation is a salvation worth suffering for. It was paid for with a great price, as we're told in chapters 1 and 2, by God through his son, Jesus Christ. And he has set the example of how we should handle the suffering. It's already been referenced several times, but specifically leading up to where we are today. At the end of chapter 2, he's talked about because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And then we have the series of quotations from Isaiah 53, that he did not commit sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. He was insulted, he did not insult in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but you have now returned to the shepherd and overseers of your soul. And that is the outline, that is the footsteps that we are to follow in and living that beautiful life amongst the pagans, the unbelievers in this world who might not only not understand why we believe, but look down on us and deride us because we do. We saw last week at the end of chapter 3, he's referenced again as they are concerned about their own suffering that they're going through and that they will continue to go through, and it will get worse. He was reminded of in verse 18 of chapter 3, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, the angels, authorities, and powers subject to him. He has told them, your best self-defense is number one, just continue to do good. Live that beautiful life. And number two, be ready to give an answer. And he gives them the answer right here. The reason for their hope is what God has accomplished through Jesus Christ. and that he suffered for our sins once for all. But has, even though they put him to death in the flesh, is alive in the spirit, was resurrected from the dead, and now seated at the right hand of God with all powers answering to him. And so he wants to continue on with focusing on what that means to us as we either entering the end times of everything, or even just the end of our life. And he focuses on first on the attitude. And that is the focus of the first 6 verses of chapter 4. We need to have the right attitude. We've been a number of folks throughout the years who have made themselves famous over having seminars and everything about positive thinking, the power of positive thinking. And Peter's not just focusing on positive thinking, he's focusing on the right thinking and where that comes from. And again, who is our model but Jesus Christ? And so verse 1 of chapter 4 harkens us back to those verses at the end of chapter 3. Specifically, Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God. He did it in service to us. And that's how he begins here, that we have to arm ourselves with the same attitude. And where in chapter 3, he discusses them defending themselves, but doing it so in a spiritual sense and doing it with gentleness and love, he actually uses here a military word that describes a soldier putting on his armor, getting ready for battle. Arm yourselves. But with what? The same kind of understanding, which is not focused on the desires of humans, but it is focused on God's will. He does make an interesting statement there toward the end of verse 1, where he talks about, because we want to have the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin. And this came to be used in later years by individuals who thought that by punishing themselves, whipping themselves, going through any kind of human fleshly punishment, even to themselves, that they could beat the desires out of them. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about that you come to a mindset where these human desires, your own selfish desires, no longer control you. The word he uses is not just finished with sin. You are no longer controlled by it. You are finished with it. That no longer is what controls you, but it is now God's will that becomes the focus. And Peter knew from all the time he spent with Jesus that was the total focus of everything Jesus did, to fulfill the will of God. Whether it was being baptized by John, whether it was going out into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan, whether it was going through the land and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God was at hand, or dying on the cross. It was about fulfilling the will of God. And he again is our example of the right kind of attitude, an attitude that uses the will of God as our direction, and is no longer given over to human desires. And he goes on with quite an extensive list, and rather descriptive list, of what human desire leads to. And again, we can sort of reference the end of chapter 3, where he talked about how evil the people were in the times before the flood, in the times of Noah, who were evil and thought evil all the time. He says that's not us anymore. When we have put our faith in Jesus, we have made a declaration of allegiance or a good conscience to God through baptism, that we are finished with that life. We've been raised to new life through the Spirit, just as Jesus was. And now we are seeking to be controlled more and more by the will of God each and every day, as The Spirit of God lives in us and guides us because he wants us to understand that uh, this is there to help us and guide us in the right way when the world tries to pull us away, or even our own selfish wants and desires do. Listen to the Spirit of God so that in the end, we're not going to be judged according to human standards, as he says in verse 6, even though the world will judge us by its standards. But God will judge us about how we live in the Spirit according to God's standards. And that we have to do it as Peter is doing to the end, because judgment is coming. He says he is ready to judge the living and the dead. Everybody will be judged, even those who have already died. And his reference in verse 5 for the reason this gospel was also preached to those who are now dead is not a continuation of his thought back in chapter 3, where he talks about Jesus going and making proclamation to the spirits in prison or the realm of the dead. He uses two totally different words, and there's two different contexts that he's using here. And where before he made a proclamation of him fulfilling the will of God to everybody, not just the world who was alive at his time, but to all those who had gone on before. This good news, the gospel, has been proclaimed since his death, burial, resurrection, and glorification. But even though people have put their faith in him, they still are dying physically. And even those who have gone on before, who are now dead, they aren't worried with the same kind of things that the world is. They could die knowing that they will not face the same judgment as the world, because they put their faith in Jesus Christ and had listened to the gospel, the good news of God's loving grace through his son Jesus. And so it's a salvation that saves us in this life. And if we hang on, it saves us in the life to come. And that's what he's wanting them to really focus on and have that attitude in mind. Because he knows if they have the right attitude, then it's going to lead to the right kind of actions in their life, which he's focused on from the very beginning, about being followers of Jesus, about being doers of good things, being respectful to everybody, no matter how they treat you, because those actions are what truly show the world what we believe. So those right attitude lead to right actions. And the connecting point, as he points out in verse 7, is prayer. And he says, so the end of all things is near. Again, they had that expectation. They had an urgency about them, and thinking that Jesus was coming any day. And it's very difficult for us to get to that point today because it's been so long and we don't know how much longer it will be before he comes. But it's not just about when Jesus comes back. It's about when I might die, which it could be at any moment, whether it's from a heart attack, whether it's from a car wreck, whether it's from COVID, whatever it might be. So be alert, sober-minded for prayer. This was important to Peter because it's something that he had failed at miserably in the garden with Jesus on that final night before he was put on trial and beaten and crucified. Jesus had taken all of his disciples up on the mountain into the garden and asked Peter, James, and John to go a little further with him and sit there and watch and be alert and pray that they would not fall into temptation. Of course, he's already told Peter that he's going to betray him 3 times. And Peter's, no, I will never do that. I am ready to die for you. And yet 3 times Jesus goes off to pray. And each time he comes back, they have fallen asleep. They are physically tired. And It's interesting that even though all three fall asleep, he picks out Peter and says, "Could you not even stay awake? You need what you need is not a physical rest and strength. What you need is spiritual strength, which would come through prayer so that they might not fall into temptation." Because as he tells them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so, as Jesus was doing, he was pouring out his heart to his Father. But in the end, he would say, "But your will be done." And through that, he gained the strength that he needed to go through the next 24 hours, which were a horrible ordeal for him physically. But prayer is that connection. Prayer is what helps us lead from just right attitudes into the right actions and doing the will of God. And the thing he focuses on, as he has throughout, is the emphasis on their relationships to each other and that they love each other deeply, that they love intently, that they love fervently. There's different ways to translate the word. It was used again by Peter back in chapter 1, verse 22. Same phrase where he encouraged him to love deeply. And then an application of that, he approaches it from a negative standpoint, that if you're going to love each other deeply, rid yourselves of all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all slander. He goes on to remind them in chapter 3, verse 8 and following, be like-minded, sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble, not paying back any evil for evil or insult for insult. On the contrary, giving a blessing, since you were called for this, so that you would inherit a blessing. A reference back to that original promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So again, he brings it up. Well, what is loving deeply? He adds to it now. Number one, a reference to Proverbs 10:12, since love covers a multitude of sins. The complete proverb begins with, hate stirs up trouble, but love covers many things, or many multitude of sins. Not because love overlooks things or just forgets about things, but because love is willing to work at it. And that, again, is what the deep is. It's not the warm, fuzzy feeling. It is a word that means that you put a great deal of effort. It's a decision that you make to work at loving others at this kind of level, so that when they offend you, you can forgive them. And when you offend them, they can forgive you because you're working at it. And that's what he wants to emphasize here. And if you're doing that, he says, you're going to be hospitable to each other. This was extremely important in their day and time, when they might travel from city to city and not know anybody when they arrived there, and they would depend on the hospitality of other Christians, just as the Jews had done for centuries, or even within their own cities, where they now have been exorcised by their friends and family, because they now have put their faith in Jesus Christ. And so they have nowhere to go. And so they have to depend on each other. But the idea of hospitality goes beyond just having someone over to your house. It includes things like we saw in the early church in Jerusalem, where there was the daily distribution of food to the widows and those who were in need. It was the sharing of the things that they had with one another, selling possessions so that no one was in need. At its core, that is hospitality. And it is an expression of the love that is deep within us, given to us and shown to us by God through his son Jesus, and then is expressed in our hospitality. It's expressed in our service, that whatever gift we have, We use it to serve others as good stewards of the varied grace of God. The idea of grace and giving a gift or having a gift is from the same word. Grace means a free gift. And he says, now you have been given these gifts that can be used to serve others. And they're all different. They're varied. Paul points this out several times in either in Romans or in 1 Corinthians 12 about the varied gifts. But use whatever you have to the service of others as good stewards, just like we're to be good stewards of the money we have that God gives us, be good stewards of what he has given us to serve others with. And understand that this is the expression of our love for God and our faith in Jesus and our loving deeply others and being willing to sacrifice for their good, just like Jesus did for ours. Remembering that doing these things, all these things that he's been talking about, doing good, living the beautiful life, none of these things themselves save us. They are an expression of our salvation. They are an expression of our faith in Jesus. And that is what God is looking for. So powerfully brought out in that parable in Matthew 25 when Jesus talks about the final judgment and the king will come and divide the people, sheep on the right, the goats on the left. And he praises the sheep and welcomes them into the kingdom prepared for them because they had done good things, gave food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, took care of one another. They visited one another in when they were imprisoned. It was the expression as they truly lived out the greatest commands of love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what he's looking for. And the goats are sent away to eternal punishment because they did not do that. And they did not put their faith in him. He says, all right, you've got the right mindset. You've got the right attitude. Now let it be expressed in this deep love for one another, which includes all the other things he's talked about in these chapters, not just this portion. And so he says, here's a summary statement, just whatever it is, in word or deed. If you're speaking, speak as if you're speaking the words of God. If you're serving, do it with the strength provided for you by God. Understand that this is where it's all coming from and that you have the power to do it because of God. Motivated by a sense of desire because of all that God has done for us, because of all that he's done to love us and to reach out to us and to save us, sacrificing his own son for us, that we do everything to his glory. It sort of leads us back to the mindset that is to be behind everything. In word or deed, in everything you do all to the glory of God. Paul expresses this several times throughout his letters. Peter's really focusing in on it here because as it's going to come up again, and beginning in verse 12, he's going to remind them again of there is a fiery ordeal coming that he wants them to be prepared for. And they have to be mentally prepared and be then involved in the things that mindset leads to when we are armed with the same understanding, the same attitude as that of Jesus, which seeks first and foremost to do the will of our Father in heaven. Because the end is near. Whether it's in an hour or two, whether it's a few days from now, whether it's 1,000 years from now, we will not be alive. We possibly suffer physical death ourselves before Jesus comes back. And so we have to be ready. And that's what he is encouraging them to do. Don't give up on your faith in Jesus Christ, no matter how much you suffer, because this salvation you have received from God is worth suffering for. When my sister died a couple of years ago, I was the only child left to care for my mother. And fortunately, she is very organized, and she had everything in place that I could find to make sure that we went to the banks and we went to the lawyers and we got everything, powers of attorney and all in place so that as health care decisions needed to be made, or even end of life decisions had to be made, we talked about it, and I know what her wishes are. And I know that she is prepared. I also know, from having witnessed my mother's life, that she is prepared for the end. She wants it to come. She asks on a regular basis, why am I still here? Why didn't Jesus just take me home? I'd just rather go home. What a wonderful mindset. And imagine how we would live every day if we got up ready to go home. And doing what God wants us to do, though, while we're still here. Not only preparing ourselves, but following in the footsteps of Jesus each and every day. I thank you again for joining us. Hope that you'll continue to join us each week as we continue through 1 Peter. We'll finish up chapter 4 this coming Sunday, and then the final chapter 5 Sunday after that. Then we're going to go right into 2 Peter because it's truly just within, seems a very short period of time, that he is aware that he's going to die. And again, he's truly trying to help them understand why this is so important. At the end of his life, these are why he is focusing on these things and wanting to share them. And I hope you've noticed as we've gone through how much he loves to quote from the Psalms, especially the Psalms of David, from the book of Isaiah, and from the teachings and life of Jesus himself, because he lived it. He saw it. He made many mistakes, and Jesus took him and healed him and made him into the rock that he became. And he wants to share those thoughts at the end of his life with his readers then and now. And so that's how we'll continue. Again, between now and then, stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, wear a mask, stay socially distanced, and when you have the opportunity, get the vaccine so that we can move quicker and closer together to finally be able to all meet together as one family of God back at our building together. So between now and then, God bless. See you next week.